Most people recognize Buckingham Palace as the London residence of the British monarchy. Fewer understand that the building they see today, with its famous balcony and Portland stone facade, represents the fourth major architectural transformation of a structure that began as something entirely different. This is not the story of kings and queens waving to crowds. This is the story of how a moderately sized townhouse built for a duke in 1703 became, through successive waves of construction, demolition, and redesign, one of the largest functioning palaces in the world. It is the story of structural failures, cost overruns, political pressures, and engineering decisions made under constraints that nearly bankrupted the project multiple times. The site itself, before any palace existed, was a mulberry garden. King James III had established it in the early 17th century as part of an ambitious but ultimately failed scheme to cultivate silkworms for a domestic silk industry. The soil composition was wrong, the climate was wrong, the silkworms died. The enterprise collapsed within years, leaving behind only the grounds. But the location remained valuable, positioned at the western edge of London, far enough from the dense, polluted centre to offer expansive space and cleaner air, yet close enough to Westminster to matter politically and socially. In 1698, John Sheffield, the first Duke of Buckingham, acquired the lease on this land. He wanted a house that reflected his elevated status, but discovered quickly that his ambition outpaced his available treasury. Sheffield was known for expenditures that consistently exceeded his income, a pattern that would define the entire trajectory of construction on this site for the next 2 centuries. He hired William Windy, an architect whose reputation rested primarily on country estates scattered across the English countryside, not urban projects of political significance. Windy had never built anything in London on this scale. Construction began in 1703 with a design that followed the English Baroque style popular among the aristocracy of the period. The plan called for a 3-story brick building with a central block and 2 advancing wings that formed a U-shaped courtyard facing east. The structure was large by the standards of a private residence, but nothing extraordinary when measured against the ducal palaces being erected elsewhere in Europe. Sheffield spent approximately £14,000 on the construction, a sum that strained his finances severely, but produced a house that became known simply as Buckingham House. It was never intended as a palace. It was a gentleman's residence with architectural pretensions and rooms decorated with materials imported at great expense. Marble from Italy, woodwork carved by craftsmen brought in from the continent. The Duke of Buckingham died in 1721. His widow remained in the house until her own death in 1743, maintaining it, but making no significant alterations. Their son, the second Duke, inherited the property, but had no sentimental attachment to it, and found the maintenance costs burdensome and irritating. The house sat largely unused for years. In 1761, King George III was searching for a private residence, away from the relentless formalities and public scrutiny of St. James's Palace, the official royal seat where every movement was observed and recorded. He purchased Buckingham House from the Sheffield family for £21,000, acquiring it not as a palace intended for state functions, but strictly as a private retreat for his wife, Queen Charlotte, and their growing family. It became known informally as the Queen's House. George III had no grand plans for expansion or transformation. He wanted a library where he could house his extensive book collection, space for his growing art acquisitions, and rooms where his family could live without the constant ceremonial obligations and rigid protocols of official court life. But the royal household grew rapidly and relentlessly. 15 children arrived over the following decades. The house, originally designed for a duke, his wife, and a modest retinue of servants, was now required to accommodate the domestic needs of a large and expanding royal family, their personal attendants, tutors, physicians, and the sprawling administrative apparatus that inevitably trailed them. Rooms were repurposed repeatedly, servants doubled and tripled up in cramped quarters. The structure itself began to show signs of strain, not from inherent structural defects in Windy's original construction, but from profound functional inadequacy for its new purpose. By the 1820s, when George IV ascended the throne following his father's long decline into madness, the building was bursting at every seam. George IV did not want a private retreat. He wanted a palace that could rival the grand continental monarchies, something that would declare Britain's imperial power and cultural sophistication not just through military strength or economic dominance, but through monumental architecture visible to the world. This is where the real construction story begins, where engineering ambition collided with political reality and fiscal constraint. George IV hired John Nash, the architect responsible for Regent Street, and the dramatic transformation of central London's urban fabric into sweeping classical thoroughfares. Nash was undeniably talented, but chronically prone to overambition and systematic underestimation of costs. The king wanted Buckingham House transformed into a palace worthy of hosting state functions, foreign dignitaries, and ceremonial events that would position Britain alongside France and Austria in architectural grandeur. Nash presented plans that required gutting the interior entirely, adding a new suite of staterooms with ceilings twice the height of the existing structure, extending the building with substantial wings to the north and south, and crowning the entire composition with a massive dome visible across London. The estimated cost submitted to Parliament in 1825 was £150,000. This figure would prove to be wildly, almost comically, inaccurate within 2 years. Nash began demolition in 1826. The original Buckingham House was largely stripped to its brick skeleton, with only load-bearing walls remaining in certain sections, while others were torn down completely. New bath stone was specified for the exterior cladding, requiring transport from Somerset quarries located over 100 miles west of London. This was not a simple matter of ordering materials. Each block had to be cut to specification at the quarry, loaded onto carts, transported along roads that turned to impassable mud in winter, then transferred to barges for the final approach along the Thames. Stone arrived irregularly and unpredictably. Craftsmen were hired in waves when materials appeared, then laid off abruptly when funds dried up or supplies stopped, then rehired weeks or months later when Parliament grudgingly released additional money after intense political pressure. The project became a political scandal almost immediately, with opposition members of Parliament seizing on it as evidence of royal extravagance during a period of economic hardship following the Napoleonic Wars. Costs escalated without apparent limit. By 1828, expenditures had exceeded £300,000, double the original estimate, and the building was nowhere near completion. Nash's dome, intended as the crowning achievement, presented immediate structural problems. The existing foundations, designed by Windy for a 3-story brick house, could not support the additional weight of a massive stone dome and the reinforced walls required beneath it. Nash ordered new foundation work, digging down and pouring additional masonry supports, but this required temporarily shoring up sections of the building that were already under construction. Workers reported cracks appearing in walls. Lime mortar was failing in certain joints, where it had been applied during winter months and had not cured properly due to freezing temperatures. The political pressure intensified. Parliament established committees to investigate the overruns. Nash was called to testify multiple times, presenting revised estimates that were immediately questioned and rejected as unrealistic. George IV, meanwhile, continued to demand changes and additions even as construction was underway. He wanted richer materials, more elaborate decorative schemes, additional rooms that had not appeared in the original plans. At one point, he insisted on installing a system of concealed corridors that would allow servants to move through the palace without being seen by guests, requiring structural modifications to walls that were already completed. The engineering challenge was not merely building a palace. It was building a palace whose specifications kept changing while construction was in progress, with financing that arrived sporadically and unpredictably, using supply chains that had no reliability, and under intense public scrutiny that treated every delay as evidence of incompetence or corruption. Then George IV died in 1830. The project should have stopped. William IV, his brother and successor, had no interest in Buckingham Palace. He preferred Clarence House and suggested that the unfinished palace be converted into barracks for soldiers, or perhaps a new home for Parliament after the old Palace of Westminster burned down in 1834. But too much money had already been spent. Parliament could not justify abandoning the project entirely. Nash, however, was dismissed. His financial management had been catastrophic, and evidence emerged that he had awarded contracts to associates and relatives without competitive bidding. He was replaced by Edward Blore, an architect known for competence and fiscal restraint rather than visionary design. Blore inherited a mess. Sections of the building were complete, others were half finished. The dome Nash had planned was structurally questionable and wildly over budget. Blore made a critical decision: abandon the dome entirely. He designed a simpler attic story to cap the building, eliminating tens of thousands of pounds in projected costs and removing the structural concerns about foundation capacity. He also enclosed Nash's open courtyard by adding a fourth wing on the eastern side, creating the enclosed quadrangle that exists today. This wing, completed in 1837, was built in a restrained neoclassical style, using cheaper materials and simpler detailing than Nash's flamboyant interiors. It was functional rather than spectacular, but it was finished, and it was within budget. Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837 and became the first monarch to actually live in Buckingham Palace as an official residence, rather than a retreat. She moved in shortly after her coronation, but the building was still incomplete in many respects. State rooms were finished, private apartments were not. Plumbing was primitive, consisting of a few water closets and wash basins supplied by rainwater collected in roof cisterns. Heating relied on fireplaces in individual rooms, meaning that corridors and stairwells remained freezing during winter months. Ventilation was poor, leading to persistent problems with indoor air quality and smoke accumulation. Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840, and the palace's functional inadequacies became immediately apparent. The building lacked sufficient bedrooms for a growing family, and the household staff required to manage royal domestic life. There was no proper nursery wing. The kitchens, located in the basement and designed for much smaller operations, were overwhelmed when required to prepare meals for state banquets hosting hundreds of guests. Smoke from cooking fires had no adequate ventilation system and frequently filled lower corridors with acrid fumes. Albert, who had a systematic mind and genuine interest in engineering and modern infrastructure, began pushing for comprehensive reforms. He was not interested in decorative additions. He wanted functional improvements based on the latest technical knowledge available. The most pressing problem was space. Victoria and Albert eventually had 9 children. The palace, even with Blore's additions, simply did not have enough rooms to house the royal family, their tutors, nurses, physicians, and the essential staff required to maintain operations. In 1847, Blore was commissioned to design a new wing that would add substantial residential capacity. This addition, built along the eastern front, required demolishing the marble arch that Nash had designed as the ceremonial entrance. The arch was physically moved to its current location at the northeast corner of Hyde Park, a logistical operation that required dismantling the structure stone by stone, numbering each piece, transporting them across London, and reassembling them with precision. The new East Wing, completed in 1850, added 19 principal bedrooms and dozens of secondary rooms for staff and service functions. But this wing introduced a new problem that would not be fully addressed for another 60 years. Blore built it using Caen stone, a French limestone chosen for its fine texture and ease of carving. The material was aesthetically appropriate, but practically disastrous. Caen stone is porous and soft. In London's industrial atmosphere, heavily polluted by coal smoke from millions of domestic fires and factory chimneys, the stone began deteriorating almost immediately. The surface absorbed soot and sulfur compounds, turning black within a decade. Worse, the stone itself began to decay chemically as acidic pollutants reacted with the calcium carbonate in the limestone. By the 1870s, sections of the facade were crumbling. Decorative elements lost definition. Water penetration led to internal damage in walls. Meanwhile, Albert was overseeing infrastructure improvements inside the building that represented some of the most advanced engineering of the period. In the early 1850s, he commissioned a comprehensive ventilation system designed by Dr. David Boswell Reed, who had previously worked on ventilation for the new Houses of Parliament. Reed's system used a network of ducts, shafts, and mechanical fans to draw fresh air into the palace and exhaust stale air and combustion products from fireplaces. It was a sophisticated approach for the era, relying on principles of thermodynamics and fluid dynamics that were still being formalized in scientific literature. The system was partially successful, but difficult to maintain, and required constant adjustment as outside temperatures changed. Albert also modernized the plumbing. In 1851, he had a system installed that brought water from the main supply provided by private water companies serving London, eliminating dependence on rainwater cisterns. This required laying new pipe networks throughout the building. a process complicated by the fact that construction was happening while the palace remained occupied. Walls had to be opened, pipes routed through existing structural elements, then everything sealed and replastered while minimizing disruption to the royal household. Bathrooms were added with hot water supplied by coal-fired boilers installed in the basement. These were significant technical achievements, placing Buckingham Palace among the best-equipped buildings in Britain in terms of sanitary infrastructure. Albert died in 1861. Victoria retreated into prolonged mourning and largely abandoned Buckingham Palace, preferring Windsor Castle and her private residences in Scotland and on the Isle of Wight. For nearly 40 years, the palace was used only for essential state functions and was otherwise closed. Maintenance was minimal, staff levels dropped. The building aged without significant intervention. When Victoria finally died in 1901, Edward VII inherited a palace that was structurally sound, but technologically outdated and aesthetically degraded by decades of deferred maintenance. Edward VII launched what he called a campaign of modernization. Electrical lighting was installed throughout the palace, replacing gas lamps and eliminating the fire risk they posed. This required a complete electrical infrastructure: generators, wiring, switchboards, fixtures, all installed in a building never designed to accommodate such systems. Electricians had to route cables behind existing plaster, through ceilings, and under floors without compromising structural integrity or historical interiors. The work took years. Central heating was also installed, using a system of hot water radiators supplied by massive boilers in the basement. This was an enormous improvement over fireplaces, but required new piping networks and radiators in every major room. The deteriorating Blore facade, however, remained a visible embarrassment. By 1912, it was clear that cosmetic repairs would not suffice. King George V authorized a complete refacing of the East Wing. Sir Aston Webb, an architect known for large public buildings, was commissioned to design a new facade. Webb chose Portland stone, a hard, durable limestone from Dorset that was already being used extensively in London for its resistance to weathering and pollution. The new facade was built in a more restrained Beaux-Arts style, simpler than Blore's neoclassical detailing, but far more durable and easier to maintain. The refacing work began in 1913 and was completed in just 3 months, an extraordinarily compressed schedule, driven by a desire to finish before the building season when the palace would be needed for social events. Workers removed Blore's Caen stone facade entirely and replaced it with a new Portland stone skin, supported by a steel framework anchored to the existing brick structure. The new facade included the famous balcony that would become one of the most recognized architectural features in the world. Though its original purpose was purely functional, it provided direct access from the principal floor to the exterior without requiring occupants to descend to ground level. The balcony was not designed for public appearances. That use evolved organically over subsequent decades as crowds gathered outside the palace during moments of national significance, and the royal family responded by appearing at the most visible point of the building. The engineering of the balcony itself was straightforward: a cantilevered stone platform supported by steel brackets embedded in the wall structure, but its cultural impact far exceeded its technical complexity. World War I interrupted further major work. The palace was never directly targeted during air raids, but the war transformed how the building was perceived publicly. It became a symbol that had to project continuity and stability during national crisis, which meant that ostentatious spending on renovations became politically impossible. The interwar period saw maintenance but little innovation. Then World War II brought Buckingham Palace directly into the conflict. The building was bombed 9 times between 1940 and 1941. The most significant strike occurred on September 13, 1940, when 2 German bombs penetrated the central courtyard. One exploded in the quadrangle, blowing out windows and damaging the structure of the north wing. The other hit the palace chapel, destroying it almost completely. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth were in residence at the time, located in a room approximately 80 yards from the explosion. The structural damage was substantial but not catastrophic. Load-bearing walls held. The building's solid Victorian construction, with its massive brick walls and redundant structural systems, prevented collapse. Repairs began immediately, but proceeded slowly due to wartime material shortages and competing priorities for reconstruction resources. The chapel was not rebuilt in its original form. Instead, the space was eventually converted into the Queen's Gallery, a public exhibition space completed in 1962 that allowed portions of the royal collection to be displayed to the public for the first time on a regular basis. This represented a fundamental shift in how Buckingham Palace functioned. It was no longer purely a private residence and ceremonial venue for the elite, but a semi-public institution with cultural and educational purposes. The post-war decades brought continuous infrastructure upgrades driven by technological change and evolving safety standards. In the 1950s, a comprehensive fire detection and suppression system was installed throughout the building, using early electronic sensors and sprinkler networks. In the 1960s and 1970s, telecommunications infrastructure was modernized repeatedly as telephone systems evolved from manual switchboards to automated exchanges to digital networks. Each upgrade required threading new cables through a structure that now contained layers of systems from different eras, creating a complex archaeological record of technological evolution embedded in the walls. By the 1990s, Buckingham Palace contained 775 rooms, including 52 royal and guest bedrooms, 188 staff bedrooms, 92 offices, and 78 bathrooms. It had become a functioning administrative complex housing not just the residential quarters of the monarch, but the offices and workspaces for the dozens of staff members who managed the operational, ceremonial, and charitable functions of the modern monarchy. The building covered approximately 77,000 square meters of floor space across multiple levels. Maintaining it required permanent teams of craftsmen, engineers, conservators, and specialists in fields ranging from historic textiles to building management systems. The garden, covering 16 hectares behind the palace, represented its own engineering achievement. The landscape had been designed and redesigned multiple times since the 18th century, but the current layout largely reflects work done in the 1820s by William Ayton, who created an artificial lake fed by the Serpentine in Hyde Park through an underground pipe system. The lake required constant management to prevent stagnation and maintain water quality. The garden also contained specimen trees, some planted over 200 years ago, whose root systems had to be monitored and managed to prevent damage to underground utilities and the palace foundations themselves. In 2017, the British government approved a 10-year, £369 million programme to undertake comprehensive renovation of Buckingham Palace's ageing infrastructure. The work, scheduled to continue until 2027, addresses fundamental systems that had reached the end of their operational life. Electrical wiring installed in the 1950s and 1960s no longer met modern safety codes. Plumbing systems were failing, with lead pipes from the Victorian era still in service in some sections. Heating and cooling systems were inefficient and inadequate for climate control requirements needed to preserve historic artworks and furnishings. The renovation required careful planning to maintain palace operations while work proceeded, with sections closed and refurbished sequentially. The project also addressed hidden structural issues that had accumulated over decades. Water damage from roof leaks had compromised timber supports in several areas. Asbestos, used extensively in construction and insulation during the mid-20th century, had to be identified and removed safely. The work represented not just maintenance, but archaeological investigation, as opening walls and floors revealed construction techniques and materials from every major phase of the building's history layered atop one another. Buckingham Palace today functions as a working building that happens to be historically significant, rather than a museum preserved in amber. It hosts over 50,000 people annually at state banquets, receptions, and garden parties. It houses a staff of nearly 800 people during peak periods. It operates as an office complex, a ceremonial venue, a private residence, and a public symbol simultaneously. The engineering challenge is not preserving it as it was at any single moment in history, but maintaining its ability to serve all these functions while respecting the layers of construction, modification, and technological integration that represent over 3 centuries of continuous adaptation. What stands on the site of that failed mulberry garden is not the vision of any single architect or monarch, but the accumulated result of hundreds of engineering decisions made under financial pressure, political scrutiny, and practical necessity. It is a building that was never finished because its purpose kept changing, and that remains unfinished today because it must continue to change as long as it continues to function.